case that shook a sleepy town in Lancashire, highlighting the gravity of hate crimes and leaving an alternative community left behind in fear. As 20-year-old Sophie Lancaster was brutally attacked just for the way she looked. What kind of people could perform such a cold-hearted, random attack? Let's find out in today's episode. Hello and welcome back to episode 11 of Charlie.inkspired. Let's have a quick catch up, shall we? Specifically, let's talk about music because it's been a little while since I plugged it and I need to do it. I'm sorry guys, don't hate me. I've got some new merch. I'll link that down below if you want to. It's unrelated to this channel, but it's related to my music and I designed it myself. So if you want to support my band, support me, please head over to our Bandcamp and you can pre-order now, but by the time this is out they'll probably be ready printed, so that would be awesome. Thank you. And last thing I have to plug about the band is I have a new single coming out. This single is coming out on the 26th of April, which is really soon, kind of leaving it last minute for myself as always, but this single is all about mental health and just being so done with feeling the way that you feel that you just want the pain to stop, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you want everything to end. To go too much in depth about it, I'll leave that for my post on Instagram. If you want to read a bit more about it, I'll probably do a video about it on my channel later on once it's released, and that's awesome. It's called Rewire, so I will also drop the pre-save link down in the bio as well, so if you can click pre-save, that really helps your artist out, so please make sure you do that. Okay, enough about me. Today we're going to delve deep into a case that is truly close to my heart. It's a case that represents a community that I'm a part of now, and it genuinely makes me feel sick to my core. It's a very well-known case, and if you are part of the alternative community, which, let's be real, most people that do listen to true crime probably are, you will know this case like the back of your hand. But we're going to go over it because it highlights a lot of important topics, and today we're going to be talking about the case of Sophie Lancaster. Before we get into that, I need to say my usual disclaimer. I mean no harm nor disrespect to the families or victims involved in today's case. These episodes are researched by myself and myself only, with the information that is already available online. I do like to put my opinions into these cases, not too much and not too heavy, don't worry, but please bear that in mind that you do not have to agree with my opinions. However, as you are entitled to yours, I am also entitled to mine. Lastly, today's episode contains topics of violence, blood and murder. So if you're not in headspace for that right now, that's absolutely fine. Pause here and go take a break and come back when you are feeling in a better space to do so. I also have a bit of a sore throat. I'm probably coming down with something as I usually do before a gig, but so I'm sorry for audio listeners specifically. You're gonna have to deal with my croaky voice because the show doesn't stop, but I will do my best to do justice to this story. With all that being said, let's take a breath in and out. Okay, let's begin. Sophie was born on the 26th of November 1986. She lived with her mum Sylvia, her dad John, and her brother Adam. The family lived in Rossendale Valley in a small town called Bacup. And Bacup was a really small town where high streets were proudly independent. The whole community knew of each other, they were really supportive, and they just really coexisted in complete harmony. Sophie and her mum had a particularly close relationship. Sylvia was a care worker, and so was naturally warm, soft and kind. And Sophie adored her mum. She wanted to grow up to be a youth worker to make sure that she followed in her mum's steps of looking after others. Throughout Sophie's childhood, she was happy, smiley and kind. Her mum said that she was always naturally introverted and she would often choose to stay at home and read a book over going out with friends. She also did experience quite a bit of anxiety when out and about in public, or even at school. She particularly started to struggle with self-confidence. But at home, when she was in her safe space and her own little environment, she was brave, confident and funny and just the real heart of the family. When Sophie was around 11 to 12 years old, she discovered her love for everything alternative, including heavy music. Her mum said that she would spend hours and hours in her bedroom just practicing new looks, experimenting with, neon hair dye and dreadlocks and black hair dye and reading Kerrang magazine and ripping pages out and sticking them on her wall. Like, we've all been there. But she was having so much fun with just finding out who she is and just getting to play around with all those things. As a teenager, she started attending gigs in the local area, where she soon found her tribe of friends. They'd all go out together to live music, gigs, local bars, things like that, and they were just really happy, just being themselves, enjoying the alternative scene and enjoying everything that it had to offer them. In the documentary about this case, one of Sophie's friends says that their first ever gig was Marilyn Manson, and it was quite an experience, but some of her favourites were like the Snakes and Pixies. And as Sophie was experimenting with all of this alternative side, her family noticed that her confidence really started to grow as she really settled into who she was. She was expressing new ways that spoke about her personality, and it just brought her so much joy. At school, on the other hand, and just generally in public, she was bullied for the way that she dressed and her appearance. She really noticed a change in the way that people were treating her as a result of her outward expression. But Sophie always did her best to just ignore them, because she wasn't doing any harm. She was simply being her, and that made her happy. So she kept going to these gigs, kept hanging out with her friends, kept, being her. And it was at these gigs that she would often go to with her friends where Sophie met the love of her life, Robert Maltby. Robert was a year older than Sophie. He was incredibly kind and intelligent. They loved the same music, the same clothes, and they were both extremely introverted apart from when it came to music and gigs. They soon fell instantly in love, and they were in a very happy relationship. Sophie's friends said that Robert was truly her soulmate. They made each other so happy. Sophie's mum adored Robert and hoped that they would be together forever. And she said that they really brought out the best in each other. Robert was also quite used to people in the general public picking on his appearance and style, but together the pair were unstoppable. Instead of walking alone whilst they were being picked on, they had each other hand in hand, and they'd laugh off these funny comments, laugh off these weird looks they'd get from strangers on the street, and suddenly the outside world and their opinions didn't matter so much to these two. I truly resonate with this story personally. I was around 14, I think, when I started experiencing with heavier music and black hair dye, dark clothing and makeup, much to my parents' dismay that I was ruining my blonde curls. Sorry, mum and dad. But my peers at school, or people in my year or my age, didn't like it. I had a group older than me that were a big fan, but when they left school and I was going into year 10 without them, people really didn't like the way I chose to express myself, and it did kind of push me into a corner to rein it back a bit, which is a shame that it got to that point, and I'm annoyed at myself that I didn't, push back, but it's all too common. And because of that, I've dipped in and out of the alternative scene repeatedly throughout the last 11 years since I left school. And it wasn't really until I kind of started dating my now partner, who is also really alternative, that I truly felt safe and supported to express myself through fashion, makeup, and the way I just present generally. So I really related to this part of Sophie's story where she felt most like her when she was with him. They had each other, and I'm so glad that they did have each other and that they experienced that love of someone who just accepts them for who they are. In the year 2006, the pair finished college and it was time to start thinking about university. Sophie decided that she really wanted to take a gap year and then go on to study an English degree, whereas Robert wanted to start studying art at Manchester Uni. With that, Robert moved to Manchester in the summer of 2006, and with Sophie being on a gap year, it kind of made sense that she went with him. After all, they spent all their time together anyway. She had a year off with not much planned, she wasn't going travelling. She just wanted to enjoy another year before she went off to uni, so they decided to make the most of their time together. So they moved to Manchester. The pair moved in and they were having the best time of their lives. It was their first time being around each other, truly alone without parents around, and just getting to experience that real adult relationship. We all remember, the first time we truly experienced that. It's a good feeling. And in summer of 2007, they celebrated their 3-year anniversary and almost a year living in Manchester together. They spent the whole summer just side by side, going to gigs, going out, and they were just really at the peak of their happiness. They had a really good group of friends around them in Manchester, and they all shared the same love for alternative heavy music and the alt scene, I guess. And on Friday the 10th of August 2007, their friend Jonathan was throwing a party. Sophie and Robert went to this party, they had a few drinks, chatted to friends, hung out for a bit, but they decided to call it a night as they had a 2-mile walk home, so they wanted to start that sooner rather than later. On their walk home, they stopped by a petrol station to buy some cigarettes. After all, it's very late, so the only place that would be open to buy such things would be a petrol station on their way home. And here they bump into a group of teenage girls who are also intoxicated. It's all very friendly, they're interacting, they're just having a chat. You know what drunk girls are like, they can make a new best friend in about 30 seconds. And that walk home, I remember the drunken walk home from uni, and that was the best part of the night. Like, I'm not even joking. You bump into other people, other students that are out, you kind of make friends, you chat. It's nice because it makes you feel safe, as it should be, to just, walk home on the streets at night. So this group of girls and Sophie and Robert decide to walk together towards Stubby Park. Stubby Park was a bit of a cut through for Sophie and Robert, and they thought, why not? Let's go through it. It's going to cut off a big corner, it will save us some time, and it's already really late. And at around 1 a.m. on the 11th of August, they arrive at the gate entrance for the park. But when they arrive, they notice a group of teenage boys lurking around. Sophie and Robert were so used to getting hate or comments that they could really sense when a group were going to pick a problem with them for the way that they looked. And they just kind of sensed that these boys could probably be trouble for them, so they just kind of kept their heads low and just walked straight past them, just quietly ignoring them. But of course, this group of boys spotted the pair and instantly started following them through the park. Sophie and Robert just kept walking, trying to ignore them, thinking if they didn't acknowledge, eventually they'll just get bored and walk off. But the group didn't get bored. They kept following and started shouting abuse across the park at the pair. They walked through the dimly lit park until they all arrived at the skate park. As they walked further into the skate park, Sophie and Robert heard the last thing they ever wanted to hear on their way home on a night out. As one of the boys shouted, "He's a mosher, hit him." One of the boys runs at Robert and punches him in the face. Taken aback by this random punch from a younger boy, Robert laughs. This angered the group, as his posse behind him shouts, "He's laughing, hit him again." And before the pair knew it, a full-fledged attack was happening. Robert was pushed to the floor as the group proceeded to punch and kick him, as well as stomping on his head. Sophie stood and watched in absolute horror. She was completely helpless as she watched the love of her life get beat up beyond recognition. The group continued to beat Robert, even after he fell unconscious. Eventually, after what felt like a lifetime, the boys backed off and started to walk away. Sophie ran to Robert and held him in her arms as she just cried and screamed in fear. When suddenly the boys stopped, hearing Sophie's cries, and decided to turn around. They saw Sophie on her knees on the floor, cradling her unconscious boyfriend with her back turned to them. And they saw an opportunity. They pushed Sophie to the ground and started punching, kicking and stamping on her head, and it wasn't long until Sophie too fell unconscious, and the boys continued to beat her until her head was covered in blood. At around 1:22 a.m, a teenage girl was passing by with a friend when she witnessed this attack. She immediately called the police and looked on from afar. Even from a distance back, watching, she could tell the gravity of the situation and how seriously these two were getting injured. Throughout the call, her friend can be heard in the background saying, "Get the fuck off them. They're practically dead already." The group of boys hear this, and knowing they've been spotted, they decide to leg it down the park and run off into the darkness. The girl and her friend stay on the phone to police and approach the pair, and she tells the police that they're bleeding so heavily. She attempts first aid with the guidance over the phone. She places them in the recovery position and attempts to stop the bleeding with her shirt, as Sophie and Robert are pouring with blood from their mouth, nose, and eyes. It didn't take long until paramedics arrived on scene. Both Sophie and Robert were so badly beaten, the paramedics struggled to determine which one of them was female and which one was male. Their faces were so swollen and disfigured and just pouring with blood that they just couldn't tell. Luckily, Robert had some ID in his pocket, so officers were able to contact Robert's family, whereas Sophie didn't have any ID on her. The pair were rushed to hospital, with Sophie being admitted as a Jane Doe. Whilst the hospital began treating the pair for their life-threatening injuries, Sophie and Robert both slip into a coma after receiving emergency surgery. Their brains were so badly damaged, it was unlikely that they would survive, and if they did, they may be left with life-altering brain damage. So, as Sophie and Robert are placed on life support, the police are left to interview witnesses and inform Robert's family of the attack. Officers arrive at Robert's family address, where they inform them of his condition. Police then asked his family whether they have any idea as to who this girl that was with him could be. And without a doubt, they knew this would have been Sophie. The pair were completely inseparable and would have definitely been walking home together that night. So the police attended Sophie's parents' address, where unfortunately nobody was home at the time. So they left a note through the door asking a number to call them urgently. Sophie's mum Sylvia returned home later that morning, finding the card on the doormat. So she went to go grab her phone to make the call. But here she discovered over 14 missed calls from her son Adam. So naturally, she calls him first, where a frantic Adam answers the phone and tells her what's happened to Sophie. With that, Sylvia and Adam both rush to Rochdale Infirmary, where Sophie lays in a coma in the ICU. Police begin their investigation by taking statements off the girl that made the call to the police. She said she saw a group of about 5 boys jumping up and down on Sophie's head, using their feet to kick and their fists to blow punches to her face. The following day, over 50 potential witnesses were questioned, all being linked to being at the park that evening. Majority of these witnesses were young teenagers, and as a result of this, they were quite reluctant to talk to the officers in fear that they'd start receiving threats from the group. So police really needed to get this information out of them, and they thought up a plan. The best way for them to do this was to send in younger officers to try and bring a more youthful approach, try and gain their trust, to see if they can get them to talk, and it worked. These witnesses, multiple of them, started to reveal that they did hear shouting in the park that night. Another set of witnesses said they saw a group of boys around the same description at the same 24-hour petrol station that Sophie and Robert had been to earlier that night, and they were washing their hands that were covered in blood. And throughout these interviews, 5 names keep popping up. These names were that of 17-year-old Daniel Mellett, 2 brothers, 17-year-old Joseph Home and 16-year-old Danny Home, 16-year-old Ryan Herbert and 15-year-old Brendan Harris. Police also managed to retrieve lager cans from the scene, as well as multiple bloody footprints. This new evidence, found at the crime scene, hand in hand with the 5 names that keep being dropped by multiple witnesses, meant that police were able to arrest the 5 boys on suspicion of GBH, grievous bodily harm. But this arrest was specifically about Robert. The definition of GBH means an assault has caused serious physical harm and can carry a maximum sentence of 5 years. If the assault is racially or religiously aggravated or as a result of a hate crime, the maximum sentence can be 7 years in custody. If the assault was committed with the intent to cause GBH or wounding, then the maximum sentence is life imprisonment. So on Sunday, the 12th of August, all of these boys were arrested for GBH against Robert, where to them, this was a big joke. They spend their entire time throughout the interview smirking, answering no comment, having a laugh with the officers. Unfortunately, by the end of their time in custody, there was no more evidence than when they came in, so all 5 boys were released on bail. Whilst the boys are on bail, the police begin to dig a bit more into the group. Unsurprisingly, they weren't clean as a whistle, and this isn't the first offence that the boys have been a part of, as earlier that year they'd also been a part of another unprovoked attack. A week after these boys were released on bail, they were arrested again, this time for GBH on Sophie. Whilst being questioned, the police made it very clear the medical state that Sophie was in, and I think this started to really sink in with some of the boys in this group. The older boys, Daniel, Joseph and Danny, all said they didn't throw any kicks or punches to Sophie specifically. However, the 2 younger boys of the group, Ryan and Brendan, did, and they were the main instigators for the whole attack. With this new information that police had, the 3 older boys were released on bail, as Ryan Herbert and Brendan Harris remained in custody. Back at the hospital, Robert made a miraculous recovery. After 10 days in a coma with a bleed on his brain, he woke up, much to the doctor's surprise. Sadly, he did wake up with brain injuries, obviously, and his brain was badly affected by this, meaning that he didn't have much memory of the attack at all. But Robert was discharged, sent home to recover, rest and regenerate with the support of his family. Sophie, on the other hand, wasn't making any progress. The hospital decide that it's in Sophie's best interest if she's transported to a specialist neurology unit in Salford. These specialist neurologists advised Sophie's family that if she did survive, she would be left with severe brain damage, and it was undetermined whether she'd even be able to remain independent. Her brain was so badly injured that she had physical boot imprint bruises on her face from where they were stamping on her face. Her ears had turned black with bruising, her neck bruised black. Her hair had been torn to the point where a part of her scalp was also missing. The hospital continued to monitor Sophie, where a scan took place. This scan revealed the worst case scenario, and Sophie was declared brain dead. Heartbroken, Sophie's family came to the difficult decision to withdraw Sophie from life support on the 24th of August 2007, just 13 days after the attack. With Ryan and Brendan still in police custody at this time, the remainder of the boys were brought in for further questioning, and they were all now being questioned on suspicion of murder for Sophie Lancaster. As the boys were being interviewed, the older three really started to realise the gravity and the result of their actions that happened that night. The three older boys, again Daniel, Joseph and Danny, continued to plead that Ryan and Brendan were the main instigators for the attack, and that those three didn't touch Sophie, they only attacked Robert. They said they did have a part in Robert's attack, however when Sophie was being attacked by Ryan and Brendan, they stood back and watched. Arguably quite a smart move for these three boys to admit, because they're admitting to assault which resulted in GBH, sure, but they're also completely clearing themselves on suspicion of murder. Ryan, on the other hand, remained as a strong no comment throughout his interviews, whereas Brendan admitted assaulting Robert, but kind of had a similar story of, well, I didn't touch Sophie. But whilst Ryan wasn't talking to the police and stuck with a no comment, he was talking to his mum. He was allowed a phone call to a family member of his choice, where he did choose his mum, but he didn't realise that these calls are recorded and monitored. Where on the phone his mum said, "Don't worry, if you have nothing to do with it, there's nothing for them to find." But Ryan responded, "But I did." I know he's a kid, but where is his lawyer throughout all of this? Like, if you're a kid, do you have to have a lawyer on with you when you're on the phone? I don't know, but surely there must be a person advising him that everything he does in custody is recorded. People just love to incriminate themselves on a recorded line. They do. Meanwhile, investigators are searching for any more concrete evidence that can link these boys to the attack. Their bedrooms at their family homes were searched, where they collected multiple items of clothing that were covered in blood. These items were sent to a lab, where the blood was identified to be that of Sophie and Robert. With this new evidence in hand, the boys were not released on bail, and instead Ryan and Brendan were to be transferred to a youth detention unit, where the police came up with a plan to place a microphone in the back of the van with the boys as they're transferred, to see if Ryan's loose lips would once again sink his ship. And lo and behold, Ryan let slip once again. On the way to this youth detention unit, Ryan and Brendan spoke openly together about how they beat Sophie to death, with Ryan saying, quote, "I kicked her head like a football." I really think this comment shows how immature this boy is. He has no concept that this is a human being that he's talking about. Not only that, but a human being that's lost their life because of his actions that could have been prevented. He kind of just doesn't seem to grasp that. On the lead up to the trial, Ryan's defence tried to plead for manslaughter due to diminished responsibility, stating that the reason for this is because Ryan has suspected autism. A specialist child psychologist interviewed Ryan and assessed him, where it was later revealed to the court in trial that Ryan did not have autism. On the 10th of March 2008, the trial began, where Ryan Herbert was the first to take the stand. And much to everyone's shock, on the very first day of trial, Ryan confessed to the murder of Sophie Lancaster. This meant that the murder charges against Daniel, Joseph and Danny were all dropped. However, they were charged for GBH against Robert. But this left Brendan and Ryan facing charges for murder. It was revealed to the courts that Brendan was the first to throw a punch this evening, initiating the attack on Robert, where all the boys then joined in, whereas when Brendan and Ryan started punching Sophie, the older three stood back and watched. Both boys were found guilty of Sophie's murder. Brendan Harris was sentenced to life with 18 years, whereas Ryan Herbert was initially sentenced to 16 years and 3 months. However, he later won an appeal, which lowered his sentence to 15 years and 6 months. I'm going to assume the fact that Brendan was the first to throw the punch is what got him a longer sentence, and probably the fact that Ryan confessed to the murder within the first day, that probably got him a little bit of a lesser sentence. I don't know how the appeal lowered his sentence again. I struggle to find that information, but if you do know, drop it in the comments below. But given the fact that Ryan pretty much boasted in the back of the police car that he kicked her head like a football, I don't know, there shows some intent there that, he knew what he was doing. The older boys, on the other hand, all pled guilty to GBH on Robert. Daniel Mellett was sentenced to 4 years and 4 months, whereas brothers Joseph and Danny Home were both sentenced to 5 years and 10 months, meaning at the time of this episode, only Brendan remains in prison and the rest have served their sentence and live a free life, with Ryan being the age of 31 today. Robert has since spoken out to the BBC and multiple news articles since this attack. He said that when he saw Sophie's coffin, it felt too small, or at least it represented how young Sophie was. But it made him think, is that all she's worth? Since he lost Sophie, Robert had an interview with the BBC, marking the 10-year anniversary of Sophie's murder. In this interview, he reveals that after the attack, he hid himself away and was completely alone without Sophie. He didn't go outside for months. He didn't feel safe. And who can blame him? This poor man spent his childhood getting bullied and spent months recovering from critical physical injuries that nearly lost him his life. But arguably worst of all, he lost the love of his life. That's something that you don't really recover from that age, I don't think, especially when you lose them in such a way. But Robert rounded this interview up by saying, people are more good than bad. Robert ended up finishing his degree of illustration at Manchester School of Art, 10 years after he first started studying. And this truly is testament to his character. The fact that even after everything, he still seeks the good and the positive in people. And he was determined and finished his art degree. Sophie's family have done a lot of work since Sophie's murder. In fact, you probably know this case because of the charity that Sylvia set up herself. Sylvia set up the Sophie Lancaster Foundation, which is otherwise known as Sophie, which stands for Stamp Out Prejudice, Hatred and Intolerance Everywhere. I'll link the foundation in the episode description below for you guys, so please go check that out. It's a really important charity that really helps educate children and young people on prejudice and hate crimes. This case shaped a lot of things in society, including how the law identifies hate crimes, forcing it to recognise that hate crimes go far beyond race, sex and sexuality. In 2014, Sophie's mum Sylvia was awarded an OBE for her hard work in protecting children. Later, she sadly passed away in April 2022. Sophie was kind, smart and a soft young woman who had a whole life full of creativity and love ahead of her. The fact that children took this away from her just because they didn't like the way she dressed is so horrendous. Did that satisfy their personal taste or personal distaste to their appearance? Are they proud that they hated a culture so much that they took away a life? Every case I research angers me because I shouldn't be sat here talking about them. They shouldn't be a thing. But this is the world we live in, and there's something particularly about this case that feels so preventable from the perpetrator's perspective. Like, they simply could have just not, if you know what I mean. They could have just not. It seems so simple, and it really gets me riled up, probably because I'm in the alternative community that, you know, Sophie lost her life because she was a part of. Maybe it just hits home a bit for me. I don't know. But yeah, every time I think of Sophie in this case, it does get me emotional because I don't want it to take away from other cases that I cover because there's no reason for any of them, ever. I don't know. Yeah, I think probably this one just hits a bit close to home for me. But it goes without saying, that goes for any hate crime. Your personal preference should never be the reason for someone's untimely and tragic death. And there we have it, guys. That was the case of Sophie Lancaster. Go do something nice today, drink some water, keep hydrated. I hope you are enjoying the sunlight as we are in daylight saving hours now. It's so nice and so welcome in my life. It's made such a difference to my mental health already. In the 2 weeks that we've had an hour extra of sunlight, it's crazy how quickly it can just shift your mental health, huh? If you are watching on YouTube, please subscribe to my channel so you never miss another true crime video from me. I also do other content that isn't true crime related. Currently it's a lot of tattoo content, but I will be posting more on there. Comment below what you thought of this case and comment if there's any cases that you want me to cover next. I really want your feedback. I want to record cases that you want to hear about. If you want an extra gold star from me, make sure you share this episode on your socials and tag me at Charlie.inkspired. I will repost and send you a message of love. I really adore all the lovely comments you guys provide to me. Like, you listen to these really awful cases, but you still have such nice things to say about the way I present them, the way I talk about them, and that's really good because I want to do these stories justice. I really care. If you are listening on Spotify, please leave a review. Say what you want to say, but if you want to give me a 5-star review, that would be wonderful. Thank you. With all that being said, guys, before I lose my voice anymore and you have to listen to this croaky mess, we're going to call it there and I'll catch you next time. Bye.